She married the man no one survived on a Stormworld, and found paradise instead. Welcome to SciFi Nebula, where we take raw, human stories and launch them to the far frontier. Today's tale begins with a contract marriage no one could endure, on a world where the wind chews metal and the sky bleeds static. Elena Hartwell is out of credits and out of options. Jax Blackwood is out of patience and almost out of time. On Montera 3, at the edge of human space, they sign a paper to survive, and discover a different kind of gravity. What follows isn't a fairy tale. It's the work of building a home in a place that wants you gone. The storms are real. So is the debt. So is the love. Chapter 1, The Advertisement That Promised Nothing. The screen on the Frontier workboard flickered like a dying star, and Elena Hartwell read the listing for the 7th time that cold morning at Cedar Dock. Widower seeks practical co-partner for homestead license renewal. Contract marriage. Not romantic. Prior arrangements unsuccessful. Must withstand isolation, ion storm exposure, and high labor demand. Financial stability guaranteed. J. Blackwood, Copper Creek Basin, Montera 3. 12 credits in her pocket. 8 months a widow. No family within 5 systems. The bioloom on which she once wove synthetic silk had shut down with the last shipment. The supervisor had smiled with the tender politeness of someone firing a stray. The boarding clerk had given her until Friday to clear her bunk. The industrial heaters coughed metal breath over chapped hands. Somewhere in the corridor someone laughed too loudly, a brittle sound of people pretending they still believed in luck. Elena wasn't looking for love. Love was buried with Thomas, along with the child that never made it past a heartbeat and a name. What she needed was a roof that did not leak and a reason to stand up in the morning. Cedar Dock had taught her something about pity. It came packaged with advice. "You're still young," said the market baker who watched her count coins for stale bread. "You could pull a shift at the rail bars," said her late husband's cousin, like a man offering charity he wouldn't have to see. "Or sign a freight crew," said a stranger, "if you don't mind accidents." She'd heard of contract marriages out on the rim, legal partnerships that ticked the boxes regulators loved, cohabitation, shared accounts, stable labor pool, without promising anything messier. Some turned to companionship. Others cracked like ice. What caught Elena wasn't romance, it was honesty. Most postings lied with lace. This one said, "Not romantic." It also said, "Unsuccessful," 3 times, according to whispers. A woman in the parts shop had lowered her voice over a tray of bolts. Blackwood? Biggest spread in the basin. No one lasts. First partner came back white-eyed. The second was tough as rebar and broke anyway. Third ran in a sleep suit and didn't stop to pack. "Why?" Elena asked. "War," the woman said, and didn't elaborate. In the rim, that was a complete sentence. She thought about the words financial stability guaranteed. Thought about the way the ion wind moaned through Cedar Dock's cracked seals at night, like a living thing trying to get in. Thought about how every corridor turned smaller when you had no next step. Elena took a deep breath and wrote. "Mr. Blackwood. I am 28, widowed, with no dependents. I understand this is a business arrangement. I can manage domestic systems, ledger, repairs, meal synth queues, basic medical, and ranch support. I do not seek romance. If terms are agreeable, I can arrive by the 28th, 1415. E. Hartwell." She sent it before her nerve could throttle the send icon. The reply hit her slate 4 days later with a ticket code and 8 words that sounded like footfalls on steel. Arrive 28-03, 1415. Millfield Station. Bring essentials. Weather shifts. J. Blackwood. 20 credits transferred. Enough to make her hands shake because it meant the world would change. On the morning she left, Elena packed her life into a single grip bag, 2 work suits, a thread kit, a slim copy of an old Earth book her grandmother had loved, a digital of Thomas in a creased field jacket, and a small harmonica that made no sound in vacuum. She closed the bag. She didn't pray. She stepped onto the shuttle and watched Cedar Dock fall away like a scab she had finally stopped picking. The shuttle burned through thin cloud and into the flat light of Montara 3's high noon. Outside the port, the ion curtains shimmered, a cold, metallic aurora. Elena touched the harmonica through canvas. Dangerous is a choice, she murmured. So is doing nothing. The shuttle angled toward Millfield Station, and the noise of the engine swallowed the rest. Chapter 2, The Stormworld and the Man of Fewer Words. Millfield Station was a welded skeleton clinging to a shelf of red rock. A sun-bleached sign over the cargo door read Module 847 in hand-painted numerals that had known better days. The wind tasted like copper pennies and old batteries. He was impossible to miss, tall, broad-shouldered, leaning against a matte black hoverbike the way a cliff leans into weather. Hat brim pulled low, not fashion, but function. A pale scar tracked from his left temple to the ridge of his cheekbone, a white wire laid under skin. His eyes were the blue of thin air. He didn't move toward her. He waited. Mr. Blackwood, Elena said when she was close enough to smell dust and machine oil. Ms. Hartwell. His voice was low and rough, like it had learned to cross distance against the wind. You came. Did you think I wouldn't? The others changed their minds at the last minute. He took her grip bag without ceremony. This all? It's what I have. He nodded, like she'd solved a problem he respected. Ride with me. 8 miles. Roads rough. She swung onto the back of the hoverbike. He didn't look back to see if she was settled. He didn't offer reassurances. The bike lifted on a cushion of humming air, and they arrowed out across the Copper Creek flats. Montara 3 was ugly in a way that grows on you. The land rolled in rust-red humps, skinned with wiregrass that flashed a faint metallic sheen when the wind hit right. In the distance, dark shapes moved, longhorn copper cattle, gene-edited for electrical resistance, their horns veined like ore. The sky was a high glass bowl with scratches in it, contrails from orbital ferries and the long smear of dust that meant the next storm was not a rumor. They didn't speak for the first hour. It wasn't only that he was a quiet man. It was that the land itself demanded silence the way an operating room does. Elena held on, watched the basin unfold, and realized isolation had never looked so honest. When they crested the last rise, the ranch lay below them like a diagram. 8 habitat modules around a central courtyard. 2 barn domes. Water pipes tracked like ribs. Corrals mapped in smart fencing. A long, low building, bunkhouse, and the pale thread of Copper Creek itself, channelized and stubborn. It was impressive in the way of machines built to last. It was also empty of ornament, as if no one had lived here, only worked. Inside, the main hab was spotless and heartless. Floors without rugs, walls without pictures, shelves without memory. The kitchen was a study in efficiency, cast iron range beside induction plates, copper pans hanging neatly, cold store whispering to itself. Everything labeled. Nothing soft. Your room, he said, and led her up a metal spine of stairs. Second on the right. My room? She tried to keep relief out of her voice and might have failed. I said contract, Jax replied. Not pretense. His gaze was level. Your safety is non-negotiable. He showed her the pantry, the water ration monitor, the breaker panel for the storm shutters. Breakfast 0600. Coffee's on a timer. He paused on the stairs. Ms. Hartwell. Yes. The other women left because they wanted something I couldn't give them. Remember what this is, and we'll be fine. He left her in the corridor, footsteps hollow on metal. Elena unpacked, which took 3 minutes and no room at all. In the wardrobe, her 2 work suits looked like apologies. She placed the harmonica on the desk, then tucked it into a drawer like a secret. She washed her face at the basin and stared at herself until the wind outside struck the hab and the wall shivered. Somewhere in the complex, a door sighed open and closed. Somewhere, a man who'd lost 3 wives to nothing she could name read his ledgers and did not look up. That night, Elena lay in a bed that had never learned anyone's weight. The storm shutters hissed as they adjusted to the rising gusts. The pipes ticked like insects. The cattle lowed in a distance her ears could feel but not measure. The fear she expected didn't come. In its place stood something narrower and brighter, a plan. In the morning, she would find the pantry ledger. She would count what could be counted and make a list of the rest. She would not ask to be comforted. She would be useful. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in months, she fell asleep without bracing for the drop. Chapter 3, The First Test. The house rose before dawn and so did he. By the time Elena followed the smell of coffee to the kitchen, the outer door had closed and the tracker display winked with the tiny green dot that was Jax's transponder headed toward the east pastures. He returned an hour later with wind in his hair and mud on his boots, ate quickly, and read a ledger slab while chewing. The books need attention, he said without looking up. Previous arrangements didn't include bookkeeping. I can manage the household accounts, Elena replied. And map them to your ranch ops if you give me read access. He slid the access key across the table without comment. Routine settled around them like a clean sheet. Jax was a man of tasks and maps. Elena was a woman of lists and labels. She inventoried the pantry, reorganized the cold store by expiration and use case, and retagged the med kit. She found places where the hab had rubbed raw, rubber seals going brittle, a latch that needed shimming, an extractor that whined, and wrote them down in tidy order. The study held its own silence. In the bottom drawer of the desk, Elena found 3 databooks tied with blue ribbon and names embossed in neat white letters: Rebecca, Martha, Susan. She held them. She didn't open them. Whatever those women had written belonged to the man in the barn and to the ghosts who wore their names. She put the books back exactly as she'd found them, aligning the corners with care. The first crisis did not send a warning. It began as a tremor under her feet. Then the courtyard cameras flashed to life, and the monitors showed 3 riders coming hard, spattered with red mud. Jax vaulted from his saddle before the bike had settled, and together they hauled a young hand into the kitchen on a makeshift litter, his leg bent in a shape a leg shouldn't try. Tommy, one of the men panted. Bull spooked at the fence charge. Through him. The medbot could stabilize, but it couldn't reset bones with judgment. Elena moved without thinking, clearing the table, setting the kettle to boil for heat and steam, tearing linens, pulling the whiskey from the cupboard and a pair of pliers she'd sterilized the week before. She looked at Jax. We need traction and someone to keep him under, she said. I'll hold. You align. Jax's eyes met hers over the boy's gray face. Something like surprise flickered and was gone. On my count, he said. It was ugly work. Tommy screamed until he ran out of air and made a sound that wasn't a sound. The bone slid, resisted, slid again, and then, like a drawer seating, found home. Elena's arms shook, but she did not let go. She talked to him low and steady, the way you talk to frightened animals and dying men. Breathe with me. In. Out. That's it. You're here. They splinted the leg with cut panels and strapped him to the litter. When the boy slept with the help of a measured dose of whiskey and a hiss from the med injector, the kitchen smelled of metal and sweat and something burned on the bottom of a forgotten pan. You know your way around damage, Jax said quietly at the door. So do you, Elena replied, rinsing blood from her hands. Water steamed in the basin. The difference is sometimes mine heals. He studied her then, really looked, as if recalibrating a measurement he'd trusted too long. The wind pushed against the shutters. In the distance, the herd moved like a slow tide around a rock. Thank you, he said. 2 words, but they belonged to a language he hadn't spoken in a while. For the next days, the ranch changed by degrees you could miss if you weren't the type to measure. Jax lingered at breakfast long enough to ask her opinion on feed ratios and fence maintenance cycles. Elena shifted the household budget and found 3 places to stop the bleed without cutting into bone. The cooktop learned to make food that tasted like more than calories. The bunkhouse laughter thinned the silence. And then the storm came. It announced itself with a pressure drop that made Elena's ears click and a smear of darkness on the horizon like a bruise. The basin's early warning mast lit yellow, then red. Shutters slammed. The air changed, charged, metallic. Jax was already in the doorway, pulling on gloves. "Barn roof's vulnerable on the west side," he said. "If that goes, we lose animals." "Then we don't let it go," Elena said, and reached for her coat. He opened his mouth to argue, then didn't. The storm hit like a switch flipped by a god with a temper. The ion squalls howled. The barn dome took a direct slap of wind, and a panel tore with the sound of something expensive failing. Longhorns screamed and turned circles, horns flashing, eyes white. The air snapped at exposed skin, electric, mean. Elena moved into it the way she had moved into grief, one step, then the next. She kept her hands open and her voice low, the old farm cadence returning like a muscle memory. "Easy, big man. Easy. I see you." She caught the lead bull's halter ring and let him lean anger into her arm as Jax and the hands opened the auxiliary pen. They walked him slow. They walked him through. 2 hours later, soaked through and shaking, they shut the last gate and listened to the storm tear around the outside of what they'd saved. The barn groaned but held. Jax's breath fogged in the cold air. Elena pushed wet hair out of her face and found him watching her with an expression she could not name. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes," she said simply. "I did. This is my home, too." A quiet fell that had nothing to do with weather. He looked as if someone had handed him a word that unlocked a door he had been trying not to see. "You could have died," he said, the line of his jaw hard enough to cut. "So could you." The corner of his mouth did something complicated. "I'll get dry clothes." He came back with a folded stack, men's work pants, a flannel that would be a dress on her. Elena changed behind the pantry door, rolled sleeves until they stayed. They drank coffee hot and black while the storm dragged its knives across the roof. "The west panel needs replacing," he said finally. "And the truss we backbraced last year is going to fail if we don't rebuild." "How much?" "Too much." His mouth flattened. "We'll manage. I have 200 credits saved." She held up a hand when he started to shake his head. "Not charity. Partnership. You said that word first." His gaze didn't soften so much as steady. "The other women." "I am not the other women," Elena said, and was surprised by the strength in her own voice. "No," he agreed after a beat. "You are not." Outside, the storm kept arguing with the house. Inside, something that had been braced for collapse found a different use for its beams. Chapter 4, After the Storm, A Different Kind of Roof. The storm limped off toward the northern flats, dragging tatters of cloud and a sullen glare of lightning. The ranch smelled of wet dust and ozone. In the washed-out morning, Elena and Jax walked the damage. The west barn support truss had twisted like a tired ankle. A seam along the dome had peeled back 3 meters, caught and held only because someone, probably Jax, had overbuilt a minor brace like he'd been waiting for equipment to betray him. Panels lay in the yard like fallen scales, edges blackened by static scorch. A length of smart fencing on the south line pulsed a lazy blue, which meant it was working hard to pretend it wasn't failing. 3 days of work, Jax said, eyes on the truss, and 2 we can't spare. He rattled off a list of materials: carbon ribs, bolts, sealant, a new tension collar. His voice made plans around costs he didn't say. "Let me see your suppliers," Elena said. He looked at her like she'd asked to ride the first bull in the corral. "This isn't a household run. It is if it keeps the house we live in from leaking," she said. "Give me an hour with your contracts." An hour later, she'd mapped 3 vendors against old invoices and found a bulk credit promotion none of the previous partners had thought to ask for. She called the Millfield yard manager and negotiated the discount up 2 points with the gentle relentlessness of someone who has been told no and learned to make it a starting position. When she was done, she added a second list: things the ranch could salvage from its own boneyard and the places to cut without bleeding out. Jax read her notes with the quiet concentration he gave to weather. "You move numbers like you move cattle," he said at last. Firm hand. Low voice. "Numbers panic easier than bulls," she said. "You just can't hear it." They spent the day as a team that had learned how to be one under wind. Jax climbed, braced, drove bolts. Elena fed line, held, sealed seams, and ran load diagnostics from an old tablet whose corner was chipped like a tooth. When the sun cut through the afternoon, the dome shone with new panels, and the west truss sat true. The small things changed, too. Elena pinned a drying line by the stove for gloves that wouldn't crisp under the heater. She cut the last of the storm-wilted greens from the hydro trays and turned them into a stew with a taste that made the hands go quiet and then appreciative. She moved a cracked ceramic mug from a top shelf to the lower cabinet she used, and no one moved it back. At dusk, they checked the south fence. The charge unit hummed wrong, too hot, too soon. Elena squatted and opened the casing. "Your regulator's lying," she said, touching the whispering faceplate with the back of her hand. "It spikes on gusts. On a long storm it'll cook itself." Jax watched her pull the board, lay it on a rag, and work with a delicate screwdriver and the concentration of prayer. "How many systems can you fix?" he asked. "As many as I can get my hands on," she said, not looking up. "Grew up on a farm that couldn't afford new. Everything we owned had already lived a life elsewhere. If it broke, it got a second chance." She felt him watching her like the way you watch a storm front, with respect, and a little awe because of what it can do if you're not paying attention. They finished as the light slid off the land. Back at the hab, Elena stood in the doorway of a room at the end of the hall. The lock on the master was simple, mechanical, not digital. She didn't try it. She didn't ask. She closed her hand on the frame and then let go. Some doors open only when the person on the other side wants air. That night, the ranch had a different sound. Not silence. Something steadier. Jax lingered in the kitchen, elbows on the table like a man who wanted to be in the room with more than his accounts. He asked, "Coffee this good every morning?" "It depends if you keep letting me ruin your efficient system with inconvenient comforts." His mouth tipped. "I'll authorize appropriate levels of inconvenience." He said her name then, not Miss Hartwell, but Elena, to ask if she'd add feed order projections to the ledger. Hearing it from him made it sound like something he meant to keep. When she went to bed, the harmonica in her drawer felt heavier. She thought about the way Jax had looked at her after she'd said "this is my home," too, like he was setting a tool back in a place he intended to find again. They were not in love. They were standing on the same floor. Sometimes that's where love decides it has room. Chapter 5, The Harmonica and the Debt. The afternoon had that rare quality Montera, 3 saved for people who stayed. The wind took a breath, the light went gold not harsh, the dust settled like patience. Elena was in the garden strip behind the hab, coaxing herb trays back from neglect, when she heard it, thin, silver, and haunting as a train that never stops here. Harmonica. It came from the barn, a ribbon of melody that braided sorrow with something like stubborn hope. Elena stood with dirt in her nails and water beating off her knuckles and listened. The song gathered the long distances of the basin and put them in her chest. She followed the sound to the open barn door. Jax sat on a hay bale with the light making a pale crown of dust around him. The scar on his face made a hard line through a soft expression she had not seen. Eyes closed, hands sure, he played like a man who had needed a language without words and had found one. When he opened his eyes, the song collapsed into silence so fast it felt like a door slamming. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Elena said. "You didn't." His tone suggested she had, but also that he didn't know how to leave the door open once someone was there. "It's beautiful," she said. He put the harmonica in his shirt pocket with the care you give a small animal. Picked it up, elsewhere. The pause was a country and several years wide. Helped pass time. "I'm glad it didn't pass all of it," she said, and turned away because pressing was the same as breaking. That night, the ledgers came out. They didn't come out because Elena asked. They came out because Jax had decided that trust, like a fence, has to be built where the stock will test it. He laid the figures on the table, the neat columns marching across the slab. "We aren't what we look like," he said without embarrassment. "The house and the land make a promise. The numbers don't keep it." She read. Bought the ranch with discharge pay and a bank loan. Stocked the herd with premium lines that were supposed to pay for themselves and the future. 3 good years, then the kind of years frontiers collect: blight, market dips, storms that rip shallow savings like roofs. "The Millfield Bank holds most of it," he said. "The Frontier Development Agency holds the rest. They've been patient. Patience expires." "How patient?" Elena asked. "End of August," he said. "We need 3,000. Sooner is better." 3,000 credits might as well have been 3 million in some languages. Elena's math ran through accounts that had names like food and future and came up short. "Selling land," she tried. "Not while I breathe," he said, "and it wasn't pride so much as the last boundary you draw around yourself when the world has taken more than you plan to lose." Elena looked at the numbers again. She looked at the herd in her head, fat, healthy, mean, beautiful, and thought about where the money went after they sold. "You've been selling at auction with every other desperate rancher, haven't you? Since the year we bought bulls we couldn't afford not to buy." She reached into a pocket, slid a folded market report across the table. She'd been reading them quietly for weeks, the way you eavesdrop on a conversation you intend to join at the right moment. Premium beef is moving in Denver Orbital and on the Windsor chain. The rail lines want a story they can carve and plate. They pay for consistency, not pity. Jax's mouth went flat. Auctions are ugly but easy. The other side of that is pretty but complicated. "Complicated," she said, "is where I live." He tipped his head, which in his language was appraisal without dismissal. "You want to ride up there and sell cattle to men who don't think women belong in the pricing room?" "Do they think cattle belong there?" she asked. "If so, I'll fit in fine." He held her gaze. The scar on his cheek had a heartbeat. "Why risk it?" "Because we already are," she said. "Every day we do nothing is a gamble we lose slow." She pointed to the ledger. "We carry good product. We don't present like it. Let me help you change that." The silence felt like the moment between the first drop of rain and the way the storm decides to come in. 3 days, he said at last. "If we do it right. You'll need to look like someone who is already winning. We both will." "Then we will," she said, and heard the "we" in her mouth like a new tool that fit her grip exactly. The next 3 days belonged to preparation. Elena pulled a navy suit from a thrift parcel she'd been hiding for 5 years, bought for a different future, saved because a woman always knows she will need one good suit when the door opens. She recut the jacket to fit the work she did now, not the girl who had bought it. She braided her hair with a line of copper thread that glinted like something accidental and deliberate at once. Jax found a charcoal coat he'd never had reason to wear and let Elena pin the cuffs and clean the dust from seams clothes keep even in closed trunks. Together they packed a pitch book that wasn't a lie: herd composition, breed lines, feed cycles, electrical resilience metrics, and the slaughter weights that made chefs nod. Before bed, Elena walked past the master door again, pausing without touching. Jack saw her in the hall and didn't flinch the way he would have a week ago. "It stays closed because I don't know what opening it makes me owe," he said. "You don't owe anyone a museum to pain," she said. "It can be a room again when you want it." "I don't know what I want," he admitted, and that was the bravest thing she'd heard him say. "You don't have to yet," she said. "Wanting is a luxury. Choosing isn't." They chose Denver in the morning. Chapter 6, Denver Orbital, How to Be the Story People Pay For. The Brown Spire Hotel rose from the station concourse like a cathedral built by accountants, arches, marble, and an atrium that climbed until your neck hurt. Men and women in suits cut from shiny money crossed the floor with the confidence of people whose mistakes were padded by someone else's safety net. Elena stepped into it with her shoulders back and her chin level. Jax beside her looked like what he was, a man who wrestled storms, polished just enough to make people look twice and then decide they'd always known his name. "Perception doesn't change the herd," Jack said under his breath as the lift doors closed. "It changes what someone will pay to slice it thin," Elena said, and smiled at their reflection because they looked like a pair that had learned to play the same game. They didn't go to the seller's pen with its bleary-eyed optimism and stale coffee. They went to the buyer's lounge, where real decisions got made in low voices over better coffee. Samuel Morrison stood by the urn reading something on a slab and radiating the alert boredom of a man who is never as casual as you think. "Blackwood," Jack said, offering a hand first with the easy authority buyers recognized as their own. "Copper Creek Basin." Morrison glanced at the hand, then the man, then the woman, and made the quick calculation of value professionals do. "Morrison," he said. "Rail lines. Hotel group." He flicked his eyes to Elena and away, curiosity you could pretend not to notice if you liked. "We've run Angus copper lines under ion exposure," Jack said. "Consistency at weight without sacrificing flavor profile. No hormone cheats. Pasture when the sky allows it, controlled feed when it doesn't." Morrison's attention clicked up a notch. "Everybody says consistency. Few deliver." "Because they don't build for it," Elena said. "We are onboarding a 3-year rotation tuned to your menus. The question isn't whether we can deliver. It's whether you want a supplier who curates inventory for your brand instead of dumping whatever the weather didn't kill." Morrison's smile said, "There you are. I take it you run operations." "She runs what should be run," Jack said simply. It did more than a compliment could have. "The ring opens in 20, Morrison said. "I'll be watching." "Of course you will," Elena said, as if she expected nothing less. On the floor, the auction was a hungry machine. Lots blinked on the display, animals went through, numbers climbed and stalled and climbed again. When Copper Creek came up, Jax positioned them not at the seller's rail but in the pocket where the main buyers clustered so they wouldn't have to squint across a room to judge them. Opening bids landed in the predictable trench. 42. 45. A lazy 50. Jax kept his face neutral, which read to anyone who'd ever traded as "we can leave." Elena stood near Morrison, not looking at him, and said just loud enough, to no one in particular, "If we split the premium lots later for the Windsor Group, we'll need a separate ledger. It'll be messy." Morrison's chin lifted. 60. A ripple of recalculation moved through the cluster. Another buyer went to 62 because men like that don't enjoy being surprised. Someone else jumped to 68 because he sold to a chef who liked to win. Jax waited until the number cleared the mark Elena had drawn with a nail on the inside of his wrist that morning, a small, private signal, and then gave the nod that said yes. The next lots obeyed different gravity. When bids sagged, Jax pulled a lot like he had somewhere else to be. He did. It was pride. Elena slipped small phrases into the air: rotational consistency, ion fatten marbling, traceable, no shorting corners. She didn't lie. She framed. By late afternoon, they had sold 400 head at an average that made the deficit blink and vanish, and then do something Jax hadn't planned for: leave a cushion. Morrison found them at the edge of the floor with his hands in his pockets and an expression that said he preferred owning good decisions before someone else did. "Tell me about exclusivity," he said. Elena returned his look with a smile that meant we both know what that word costs. 3 years, she said. A floor price indexed to your passenger volume with seasonal bonuses tied to quality verification. In return, you get first pull on our top-grade cuts and the right to talk about us in your marketing like you discovered us. Morrison's laugh was soft. I don't like pretending. But I do like being first. He tipped his head at Jax. Dinner to talk numbers. Jax glanced at Elena, which is to say he asked the person who'd be running point on the parts of the relationship that would decide whether the contract worked. She nodded. Dinner tasted like achievement and like the next problem waiting to be solved. Numbers found their boxes. Clauses met in the middle. Morrison signed what he could sign tonight and promised to move the rest through the parts of his machine that resisted change as a matter of policy. After, Jax and Elena rode the lift to the 6th floor in a silence that felt like air after weather. In the mirrored wall, they looked like people who had won something and were trying not to jinx it by saying the wrong thing. At their doors, across the hall, identical locks, Jax spoke first. I can't believe that worked, he said, which was his way of saying you were extraordinary. You make good cattle, she said. I make good contexts. He hesitated. His hand flexed on the handle. Would you? He stopped, the word tangled in the same net that had caught his music in the barn. Would I what? She asked, not rescuing him, just making space. Have dinner, he said, and then, because that wasn't what he'd meant, added, to celebrate. Not for work. I'd like that, she said. And because he looked like a man deciding whether to step onto a bridge he'd laminated himself, she added, very much. They ate in a high room with glass for walls. They talked about the land and the herd and the way the wind finds you wherever you go. The conversation widened and slowed. He told her about Sablegate, the camp where the days ran together and the rules were written in hunger, not details, but enough for her to understand the shape of the hole the war had bored through him. She told him about Thomas, about loving someone who had laughed with his whole face, and about the quiet after, which was worse. I thought I was finished with wanting, she said over the last of the coffee. Turns out I was just done with begging. His jaw worked as if around a sentence with hard syllables. He tried again. What we did today, he shook his head. It felt like having a partner. You do, she said, and did not add if you want one, because the contract had already said it and the day had confirmed it. At her door, the hall lights softened like they knew how to be kind. He held her eyes. Elena, he said. Yes, she said, and stood very still. What I'm about to say, he began, and stopped because the words felt like something you put down and can't pick up again. She didn't move. She didn't save him. She gave him the dignity of choosing. He took a breath like a diver. I don't want this to be just a way to keep a roof, he said, finally. Not anymore. Something in her, long dormant, sat up and looked around at the room it had lived in without light. Then we should talk about what else it is, she said. And the way he smiled, small and surprised and a little scared, made her think about a door at the end of a hall and a lock that might not be a lock forever. Tomorrow they would put the first signature on a contract that would change their balance sheets. Tonight, they had already started revising a different kind of ledger. Chapter 7, The Bridge We Build While We Cross. They signed the first set of papers in a quiet corner booth where the marble didn't echo every word. Morrison slid the stylus across, and Jax pressed his thumbprint with the composure of a man who had learned not to flinch when good things happened. Elena reviewed the clauses one last time: floor price index to passenger volume, seasonal quality bonuses, first pull exclusivity, and nodded. Contracts don't love you back. They simply hold you to the promises you were brave enough to make. Congratulations, Morrison said, a real smile softening the hawk lines of his eyes. You've just made my chefs very happy, and my competitors very annoyed. We'll take both, Elena said. After, the station concourse hummed around them, glass and chrome and shoes that never saw mud. They walked in a silence that wasn't empty. The kind that cradles a choice. At the observation window, Montera, 3 hung below them, rust and bone and a thin shine of atmosphere. Jax stood with his hands in his pockets like a man not sure what to do with them if he took them out. I learned, in the camp, he said without looking at her, that wanting things sometimes gets people killed. So I stopped. Wanting. Mostly. Elena watched the curve of the world where their fences drew small maps no satellite could see. The price of wanting isn't the same as the price of refusing, she said. You taught me that with the barn truss. He huffed something that might have been a laugh if he had remembered how to make one. What I'm trying to say, he went on, and failing at, is, he turned then, eyes the precise color of sky that never quite rains. I love you. It wasn't a flare. It was a steady beam. Not the kind that eats a life because it's hungry, he said. The kind that feeds it because it's there. I don't know how to do flowers or speeches. But I know how to build roofs and keep books and make a place hold. I want to do that with you. For you. If you want me. Elena had never liked grand gestures. She respected honest ones. I love you, she said, and the words fit her mouth like a tool worn smooth by use. I think I have since you put numbers on the table and didn't pretend they were better than they were. Since you trusted me with the bull's halter. Since you let me fix the fence and didn't tell me to be careful like I wasn't already. He swallowed. His hand came out of his pocket and hovered, uncertain. She took it. They did not kiss like a screen couple with a swell of strings. They kissed like people who had learned that tenderness is a practice, mouth soft, hands respectful, breath shared and unhurried. It felt like signing a second contract, the kind no one else could witness. On the shuttle home, the basin rose up to meet them, ugly and beloved. They rode the hoverbike across the flats with the wind meaner than memory and the dust colluding with the horizon. At the hab, Elena stopped at the end of the hall. Jax stood beside her. The door, he said, looking at the master, has been closed a long time. It doesn't have to mean what it meant, she said. He took a breath and turned the knob. The room was clean and unused, like a stage waiting for actors who never arrived. A bed. A window. A shelf bare as a new ledger. No ghosts except the ones a person brings with them. Jax crossed the threshold first, as if the room needed to see him come in before it could relax. Elena opened the window. The wind brought dust and the animal smell of the herd and a sound like coins rolling across a table. Jax touched the wall with his palm. I used to think opening this meant I had to explain myself, he said. What happened? Why I couldn't make it work before. You don't owe me a museum, she said. Only a room we choose to live in. He nodded. Something eased in his shoulders, and his face looked younger by an hour. Together they stripped the bed and remade it with linens that smelled like sun. Elena put a small vase on the shelf and, later, a sprig of green from the hydro trays. Jax dug out a frame from a storage bin and slid into it a photo of the herd coming over the rise at dawn, horns bright as tools. They did not draw a curtain on the past. They turned the light on in the present. That night, they lay down in a bed that would learn them. He kissed her hairline like an oath. She set her fingers in the groove above his scar like a blessing. When he folded her into him, it felt like two walls leaning toward each other, not to collapse, to hold. In the dark, they spoke softly. Not about forever. About breakfast, and which panel to order first, and whether Tommy was ready for real fence work. Their love didn't require proof. It asked for presence. Tomorrow, Jax said, sleep heavy on the word, we start building like we mean it. We already did, Elena murmured. The basin breathed, and so did they. Chapter 8, Paradise Holds. It didn't happen overnight. It happened the way houses stop leaking when you replace things you can't see. It happened in screws tightened and budgets balanced and jokes that started as accidents and became habit. They rebuilt the West Truss with carbon ribs that would laugh at weather. Elena remapped the ranch accounts so the numbers told truths early, before truths turned into fires. The hydro wing doubled, small lettuce began appearing on plates as if wealth were sometimes measured in crumble and crunch. Jax overhauled the eastern fence line with Tommy, who limped only in the rain and talked as if the break had taught him something no sermon could. Nora was given the autonomy she always earned and rarely got. She redesigned the charge regulators so the storm spikes rolled off like a shoulder refusing an insult. The bunkhouse learned how to sing again. On certain evenings, Jax would take out the harmonica and not hide it when someone walked in. The music wasn't sad anymore. It had a weight like bread. The house changed quietly. Pictures appeared, heard at dusk, a map of Montera, 3 annotated in Jax's square hand, a photo Morrison had sent of a Windsor orbital menu with Copper Creek printed without apology. Rugs softened hard floors. A blue mug lived permanently beside the coffee grinder because Elena had decided that some objects deserve the dignity of staying where a person reaches for them every day. One afternoon in late summer, with the sky clean and the wind on its best behavior, a transport set down at the edge of the yard, and Morrison stepped out in shirt sleeves, grinning like a man who had bet on the right horse when the odds looked wrong. He shook Jax's hand with both of his and hugged Elena like someone who understands that women like her demand the respect of a good hug or none at all. "Your cuts are being argued over at altitude," he reported over dinner, lifting a glass. "I thought you'd like to know that somewhere up there, people are paying extra to eat your work." "To the best partnership I've signed in years," he said when the plates were clear. "And to the proof that the best stories are built, not found." Jax's fingers found Elena's under the table and stayed there. "To finding paradise the hard way," he said. After Morrison turned in, they went to the porch, a habit they had not planned and would not break. The herd murmured in the dark. The stars did what stars do. Elena leaned into Jax's shoulder and felt the muscle there, the strength that had learned to be gentle because it chose to be. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, not looking at her because some questions are easier with sky in your eyes. Answering an advertisement that promised nothing? She considered the long road from Cedar Dock to here, the hunger, the wind, the room with the closed door, the boy on the kitchen table, the harmonica in the barn, the auction floor where they changed a story by acting like it had already changed. "Never," she said. "It wasn't a promise. It was a door. We did the rest." He smiled in the dark, she felt it more than saw it. "You're the bravest person I know," he said. "I'm just the most stubborn," she said. "You're the brave one. You opened the door." They sat a while without needing to narrate the quiet. Tomorrow would bring a fence down or a calf up, an invoice to chase or a gasket to replace. It didn't matter. They had learned to meet weather with work and work with patience and patience with kindness. And when kindness ran low, they had learned how to borrow it from each other and pay it back with interest. Elena turned toward him, her voice barely above the chorus of insects. "People talk about paradise like it's a place you stumble into," she said. "But we know better." "We do," he said. "It's a place you hold," she finished, "with your hands and your choices and your word." He kissed her knuckles like punctuation. Inside, the master room was no longer a symbol. It was a room where they slept and woke and reached for each other when the wind complained. On the shelf, next to the sprig of green that always needed water, the harmonica waited where it could be found without ceremony. Out beyond the fence, the storm mumbled to itself. It would come back. It always did. And when it did, they would meet it together. As for you, if this frontier love found you where you are, help us keep building, tap like, subscribe to SciFi Nebula, and drop a one-line thought about the moment you'd start building, not waiting.